we have worked our way through an increase in tension between the 13 colonies and Mama England. The 13 original English colonies were right along the Atlantic coast, and Mama England was supposed to be making their rules and their laws. So far we talked about the French and Indian War, which was only won because England borrowed a lot of money so it could spend a lot of money to beat the French. As a result, England needed to pay back that debt, and so they decided to tax not just people in England, but also people in the colonies. They made a tax called the Stamp Act when the colonists acted like a 3-year-old and threw a fit, repealed the Stamp Act, but then they made new laws called the Townshend Acts, and those taxed fabric, tea, lead, paint, sugar, tea. They sent soldiers to the main towns to collect the taxes, which led to the Boston Massacre. And then when the India Company in 1773 was given a monopoly on selling tea, and the tea was still taxed, Boston had a tea party. They destroyed the tea rather than pay the taxes. As a result, Boston was closed until the tea was paid for, and soldiers were sent back into Boston. Now, at that point in time, other colonies realized that they could be treated like Boston was. This is commemorating a very famous speech given by a fellow named Patrick Henry down in Virginia. So if you forget your map again, Massachusetts is up here. Virginia is down in the southern colonies. Massachusetts is in New England. Before this point in time, Massachusetts and New England thought of themselves very differently. But now all of a sudden, Massachusetts and Virginia, there we go, thought of themselves very differently. But now all of a sudden, folks down south in Virginia realize that their governor is also paid by the King of England and Parliament, so their governor could do to them exactly the same thing that was done to the colonists in Boston. Thus, Patrick Henry gives a speech to the House of Burgesses in Virginia, and the point of his speech is we need to spend money on supplies in case the soldiers come after us. We want to be able to defend ourselves. As part of his speech, he made a very, very famous statement. The most famous part is right here, but the context of it was, "Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery?" So people in the House of Burgesses, you can see some of their looks, right? They don't look too happy with him. Their argument was that if we spend money on ammunition and supplies to fight, the soldiers are going to come and attack us. So we can't do that. Patrick Henry's response was, hey, wait a minute. What price are you willing to pay for that peace? Are you willing for the government, for Parliament, for the King of England, are you willing for them to basically take away everything you own without your permission? That's what they're doing with these taxes. That's what Patrick Henry is saying without using those words. Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. So he's appealing to God, and you'll notice that's a capital G. Many, many, many of the founders of the United States were very religious. God was important to them. So he's saying, this is so important to me. I hope God would not let that happen. Then he says, I know not what course others may take, but as for me. And then here's the most famous part. Give me liberty or give me death. you need to get Patrick Henry colored. The background doesn't need to be colored, but you do need to color each person individually. The wigs would be white or gray. Dark colors, so dark blue. This fabric here was dark green. The chairs would be a very dark brown or black, as would the desk. Patrick Henry's socks are white, but his shoes are going to be black as well. You also need to write his quote on this page. This will be page 10. And you must be sure that in your table of contents, where it says quotes, you finish Patrick Henry's quote, just the most famous part of it, give me liberty or give me death, and write that down as being on page 10. With that background, we're going back to Boston. Page 11 needs to be titled Paul Revere's Ride. You will need to color these three fellows. And I need to run and get a pencil. You'd think I was prepared, but well, anyways. These three fellows, you will need to name them based on what I'm going to tell you in this video. So it does not matter to me who you decide is which one. Most likely the most important one is the one in front. You will also need to add these lines with the labels. And I'm going to now tell you that story. So we left Boston. Boston is on a peninsula. So on the peninsula, where Boston is, we left thousands of British soldiers. And they have been brought back since the Boston Tea Party, about 2 years ago, a year and a half, 2 years. And as they have been staying in town here, their general is put in charge of all of Massachusetts. So the army gets to tell every regular citizen what to do. This was a decision made by Parliament and King George III over in England. So they put General Gage in charge. They made it illegal for the Massachusetts Assembly to make laws for the people of Massachusetts. This was all part of those intolerable acts, not able to be put up with. So General Gage realizes that the colonists are not happy with this. One way he knows it is his wife was actually born in the colonies. And so she has very close friends who are telling her, wow, what your husband is doing, what the king has given your husband permission to do, this is not fair. It's not right. We don't like it. Now, General Gage's wife was not his only source of information. In fact, she didn't really give him information. She was just giving him the feeling that, yeah, people don't like what you're doing. The information for General Gage came from sending out spies. He had sent out a lot of spies, and these spies were coming back telling him that things like all of these little farming towns were getting supplies of ammunition, supplies of food like flour that could be made into bread, supplies like wagons to transport things, supplies like cannonballs and cannons and muskets, not rifles, muskets, and lead to make bullets. And these supplies were being stored in some of the little towns, not close to Boston. The closest place where supplies were being stored was in the little town of Concord, about 16 miles away from Boston. General Gage started getting concerned about this. He wrote home to Parliament and King George III. And remember, it takes about 6 months for these letters to get back and forth, which is why we're about a year and a half after the Boston Tea Party. He has, once spring hits in 1775, he has also been sending soldiers out to march around. Why? Because he's been asking Parliament and King George for permission to send his soldiers out to get the troublemakers, namely Sam Adams and John Hancock, the most important ones. And he's also asking permission to seize, to take control of the ammunition and all the other supplies that have been stored in places like Concord. So he's been sending his soldiers out to practice this. Now, he's got two ways the soldiers can go out. He either sends them across the water in little rowboats, and they march on the road from Charleston, or they can go in and out on what's called Boston Neck, this very narrow connection where the peninsula is connected onto the mainland. That's called the neck, like your neck holds your head onto the bigger part of your body. Now, obviously, he couldn't hide these soldiers marching out, so he just said, oh, we're practicing, it's nothing to worry about. But the colonists had a network of spies. And those spies, the guy that was the head of that network was named Dr. Joseph Warren. You don't have to know that, but if you study the Revolutionary War in any depth, Dr. Warren is a very important figure at the beginning. So Dr. Warren was the head of the spies, and these spies began telling him, we think the British are going to soon march out and take the supplies in Concord. And oh yeah, the assembly with Sam Adams and John Hancock has been meeting in Concord, and Sam Adams and John Hancock are staying in a little house in Lexington, not very far off the main road that goes from Boston to Concord. So we're pretty sure that these soldiers are practicing, and eventually they are going to go to Lexington and try to get Sam Adams and John Hancock, and they'll probably go on to Concord and try to get the supplies that we have hidden there. So Dr. Joseph Warren, Sam Adams, John Hancock, all these leaders of the rebellion, the Sons of Liberty, they know something is coming. And so they set things up just in case they can't get a person out of Boston to warn Sam Adams, John Hancock, the rest of the assembly, and the people who are hiding supplies in Concord. So the signal that they set up to rescue John Hancock and Sam Adams has to do with the fact that there is one church that has the tallest steeple in Boston. And you can see it a little bit here on the map that you have. This is Old North Church. The steeple of Old North Church can be seen from over on the Charlestown shore. So even as British soldiers were doing target practice in the cemetery on the hill just down the road, less than a half a block away from Old North Church, the colonists, the rebels, were making arrangements that when the British marched out of Boston, if they were going to go across by sea, 2 lanterns would be hung up in the church spire at North Church, and people on Charlestown shore would be able to go and warn Lexington and Concord. If the soldiers were going by land, there would only be 1 light, so that anybody not in Boston would still have warning which route to expect the soldiers to come along. The night of April 18th, 1775, General Gage was so prepared. He was so aware of the spies. He sent the soldiers to bed with only their commander and himself knowing about the orders. Somehow, the spies for the colonists learned about the plans. Historians think it was General Gage's wife who told Dr. Joseph Warren that the British were going to march out of Boston. They were going to take boats across to Charlestown, and they were going to march from Charleston to Lexington and Concord the morning of April 18th, or the morning of April 19th. They would leave the night of April 18th. And so, word went out to the fellow who was in charge of Old North Church. He was one of the few who had a key. He went and climbed up. Now, you can go and visit Old North Church nowadays. And the fellow who hung the lanterns, his name was Robert Newman. He lived on the corner just down the street from Old North Church. I don't have a picture of me outside Old North Church that I can find real easily, but in Robert Newman's house, soldiers had been quartered. There was not enough space for all the soldiers to have places to stay, and so regular people had to keep soldiers in their houses. In order for Robert Newman to get out of his house that night, the night of April 18th, and hang those lanterns, he actually had to sneak across the roof and jump down from the porch roof to the ground in order to go to North Church. This is what the inside looks like. He walked around up behind everything by some back stairs. The first steps look like this. The next set of steps look like this. So you put a hand and a foot and a hand and a foot. You can go take these tours. This part, everybody gets to go up. I went early that morning. The morning that I went to Old North Church, I was the only person on the tour. And so I said, I'm a teacher. Can I go up the next part? And indeed, I got to go up next to the bells in the belfry. This is where Robert Newman climbed up with those two lanterns on the night of April 18th, 1775. I just think that's way cool. So he climbs up there, he puts the two lanterns, and then he goes back home. His job is done. In the meantime, Paul Revere has gotten out of Boston. He's over on Charlestown. He gets a horse named Brown Beauty. She's waiting for him, and he's on Brown Beauty and takes off. Now, Paul Revere was not the only one to leave Boston that night. That's why there's three fellows. Paul Revere is just the most well-known of them. Why is he the most well-known? Well, we're going to skip that video. The reason Paul Revere is so well-known is because he was a very friendly fellow. He was a silversmith, so he made things out of silver, which means he knew people who were fairly rich, and he was good friends with them. His house still stands in Boston. It's the oldest house still standing in Boston. You can go visit it. They just don't let you take pictures inside, but this is what it looks like. As such a friendly fellow, we won't go there yet. As such a friendly fellow, Paul Revere knew all of the leaders of the militia between Boston and Lexington. And so as he went through these little towns, he woke up all the militia. The militia, the people who trained to defend their homes, they were also ready for this. They had a signal. Smaller groups of the militia had promised to be ready at a minute's notice. They were called Minutemen. The leader of the militia, as soon as Paul Revere woke him up, he had his gun loaded by his bed. He picked up his gun and fired it out the window. How do I know this? There are primary sources. These fellows, the ones that survived, wrote down what it was like. Their wives wrote down what it was like. We have lots of primary sources about what this day was like. So the militia captains fired out their windows, and that alarm spread outward from all of these little towns. That's also why Paul Revere is so well known. The second fellow who went out to warn, he left Boston and he went across the neck. His name was Billy Dawes. So one of these guys needs to have Paul Revere. The other guy needs to be named Billy Dawes. Billy Dawes got out of Boston, even though he wasn't supposed to. There were guards on the neck, and the guards weren't supposed to let anybody go past. But Billy Dawes had made a habit of going in and out of Boston. And as he would go past the guards, he would always act drunk. Not only that, but he would always give them some alcohol on his way past. So when Billy Dawes went out the night of April 18th, he's going out acting drunk, and he gives the guards, the British guards, some alcohol. They're like, "Oh, go on, you won't hurt anything." So both Billy Dawes and Paul Revere make their way to Lexington. They get there and they go to the house where John Hancock and Sam Adams were staying. This house still stands too. You can go visit it and take a tour. Paul Revere gets there and he starts making a whole bunch of noise trying to wake up Sam Adams and John Hancock. But remember, everybody expects the militia to come out, and they figure everybody expects the British soldiers to come out of Boston, and they figure they will probably try to arrest Sam Adams and John Hancock. And so the militia, the folks from around this area, were guarding the house where Sam Adams and John Hancock were staying. Paul Revere rides up and starts making a bunch of noise, and the militiamen guarding the house say, "Be quiet, dude. We have important people sleeping in here." And Paul Revere's like, "You're going to have enough noise by the time this night's over. Don't you be quiet me. You wake these guys up." Paul Revere woke up Sam Adams and John Hancock. They stuck their heads out of the window from the room where they were sleeping. They're like, "What's up, Paul?" He says, "Guys, you got to go. The soldiers are coming." So having warned Sam Adams and John Hancock, Paul Revere goes back to Buckman Tavern, which is where the militia then is beginning to gather. However, he and Billy Dawes decide probably they'd better go on and warn the folks at Concord where there are supplies stored. So as they leave Lexington, they are riding along the road. They are joined by a doctor. The doctor, Dr. Prescott was his name. Dr. Prescott had been in Lexington late at night because he was visiting his fiancée, the girl he was supposed to marry. Doctors at that point had the fastest horses around because they had to get to their patients really, really quickly if somebody was sick. So Paul Revere and Billy Dawes go, "Sure, Dr. Prescott, come join us. You live in Concord. You have a fast horse. The more of us that go warn Concord, the better." So they're heading on this to Concord. And as you walk on that road from Lexington to Concord, you can walk on that path. There is actually a paved road that cars go along that is parallel to it. The original road, though, is a walking path that you can go on. So it's really awesome. So as you walk on the road between Lexington and Concord, you get to a spot. Those are my feet. And the spot says Dawes, Revere, and Prescott were captured at 1:30 in the morning, April 19th, 1775. What does that mean? Well, Paul Revere, Billy Dawes, and Dr. Prescott came around a bend in the road, and they saw exactly what I saw when I walked on this. So remember, the actual road that Paul Revere and Billy Dawes and Dr. Prescott were going on is here. The paved road is within sight, and right around the corner, there was a police officer waiting to catch people in their cars speeding. So it's still a good day, a good place nowadays to wait and catch people. When Paul Revere and Billy Dawes and Dr. Prescott came around the corner, they saw 6 British officers. These 6 soldiers had been sent out ahead of, even before Paul Revere and Billy Dawes came out. Their job was to make sure nobody got through to warn Concord. So they were waiting in this field. Paul Revere, Billy Dawes, Dr. Prescott come around the corner. These 6 officers take them prisoner at gunpoint. It's still the night of April 18th. We have not had Concord warned. John Hancock and Sam Adams have been warned. We have a few militia gathering at Buckman's Tavern back here in Lexington. Meanwhile, the British soldiers were ferried across the water from Boston. They stood for a couple of hours knee-deep in wet, cold mud, waiting for all of them to be brought across. They marched those about 14, 15 miles, and we'll leave the 800 British soldiers right about here. We'll leave Sam Adams, John Hancock, and the militia over here in Lexington. We'll leave Paul Revere and Billy Dawes and Dr. Prescott having been captured. You'll have to tune in tomorrow to see what happens next.